Coming up this hour, how would a homicide detective investigate the claims of the Gospels? We're about to find out. J. Warner Wallace is here to talk about his book, Cold Case Christianity. Join us for this hour of the Janet Mefford Show.
The Janet Mefford Show.
Government's first duty is to protect the people, not run their lives.
The key is to stand on the Word of God.
We are relevant not because we are like our culture. We are relevant because we are absolutely different.
And I'm not going to apologize for taking a stand.
But if the Word of God says it, I believe it.
That's the way it is.
And now, here is Janet Mefford.
Thank you so much for joining us. When we claim that Jesus Christ is God, we are expressing a certainty in the facts and the evidence for Christianity. And in turn, our confidence in the truth of the claims of Christianity, ultimately our faith given to us by God, causes us to trust in the finished work of Christ on our behalf. But how do we know that the evidence for Christianity is solid? Well, my next guest takes a novel approach to the claims of the Bible by treating it like a homicide detective would treat a cold case. In fact, he's a homicide detective himself, as well as a missions leader and church planter. J. Warner Wallace applies this approach and talks about it in his book called Cold Case Christianity. A homicide detective investigates the claims of the Gospels. And it is great to have you here, Jim. Welcome.
Janet, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate you being here, too. I love new approaches to apologetics, and this one has never come across my desk before, and I'm intrigued by it. Why approach Christianity the way a detective would approach a cold case?
Well, it wasn't though I intended to, develop a strategy that would kind of get everyone's attention. This is just the way that I journeyed through the evidence myself in order to become a Christian. So in some ways, I'm just sharing my own journey and using some of the tools that I developed as a cold case detective to try to teach people these principles that they can use themselves to examine the case for Christianity.
That is neat. Now, you were an atheist, as I understand it before. How did you become a Christian?
I was a pretty committed atheist until I was about 35, and I was the kind of guy who typically would push back if you were a Christian and wanted to share your views. I had very determined and vocal views about my own position as an atheist, so I was kind of the guy that my friends at work who were Christians would share maybe one conversation with and then probably wouldn't come back to me on those issues anymore. So,
I've met people like you.
Yeah,
I know how that goes.
And it was a lot of stubbornness and a lot of my view was that all of us who were working as police officers and working these big cases, these big investigations, it seemed to me that of all people, we were the ones who were most committed to using evidence to determine what the truth was. And so the only way you're ever going to reach me with Christian worldview would be to demonstrate for me that it is evidentially true. And I just didn't have friends in my world who were Christians who were able to do that. And so for the most part, I think I was a little bit more disappointed with my friends who could not defend their faith than I was so much with Christians in general. But I think that I probably figured every Christian was like that.
Yeah, well, I can understand that. So when you take a detective's approach to the Gospels, where do you begin?
Well, I can tell you what my personal journey was, is that I got interested. I mean, I stepped foot for the first time in a church other than maybe for like a funeral or a wedding when I was 35, except that when I was a kid, my mom was Catholic, kind of a cultural Catholic growing up, and so I did have some experience there. But I really rejected it firmly for years and years, and at 35 I walked into a church where the pastor was able to at least convince me that Jesus was pretty smart. And he might have a few things to say that, kind of age-old, vetted, ancient wisdom that it might be applicable to me today. The same way you might be interested in Socrates or Buddha or Baha'u'llah or any other ancient sage. Not that it was true in terms of him being God, but maybe he'd have something interesting to say. And so that's how I started to even look at the words of Jesus. I did that, of course, and you have to, unfortunately, for an atheist, I had to go through the Gospels to do it. And that really started the journey because I saw things in the Gospels that I recognized as the kind of similarities to the kinds of statements I see when multiple witnesses see the same event. And then you interview them later, and you see certain attributes of those statements that I recognized in the Gospels. And so it caused me to stop and say, well, that's kind of interesting that I call this unintended eyewitness support, when somebody makes a statement and it seems confusing on its face until you get to the next witness who tells you some other little piece of it that then makes sense of the first witness's statement. I see a lot of this back and forth in eyewitness accounts, and so I started to see this in the Gospels, and it caused me to take another step.
That is so interesting. Well, and of course, Christianity would be a cold case because none of these eyewitnesses are with us, right? So it's basically a cold case whenever you can't talk to an eyewitness?
Yeah, cold cases for us in California and across the country are homicides typically, really, because there's no statute of limitations on homicide. If you're committed a robbery and a certain number of years go by, well, guess what? The statute of limitations, you're probably going to get away with it. But if you commit a murder, that never closes. And so we can work that case 20, 30, 40 years later because it's still open. And so I work homicides that have not closed. My cases are usually from about 1979 to about 1988, right in that range. And so like this case for Christianity, these are events from the distant past. We don't have any living eyewitnesses that can say, oh, yeah, I saw him do it. If we did, we would have solved it back then. We don't have any typically strong forensic evidence. We really have to build this case circumstantially given what we do know, and that's exactly what I tried to do with the case for Christianity.
That is so fascinating to me, especially because a lot of those true crime novels and a lot of those cases that are out there and so famous really have fascinated me over the years, and I think it's amazing how you guys figure out these cases. But even more exciting that you can apply this to something that actually really matters eternally.
Yes, and I think it can be applied. I think there are some principles, some basic principles that if you understand how these principles are applied to cold cases, you'll find they're actually excellent tools to use in examining the Christian worldview. And that's why I tried to spend the first half of the book just kind of, and I do take time also to include stories, so it'll be a little more entertaining than just 10 dry principles.
Absolutely, but that's what I want to dive into when we come back. J. Warner Wallace with us talking about Cold Case Christianity, a homicide detective investigates the claims of the Gospels. There's a lot more ahead. Stay with us on the Janet Mefford Show. We are back 17 past the hour on the Janet Mefford Show, talking about how a homicide detective would investigate the claims of the Gospels. It's all in the book Cold Case Christianity by J. Warner Wallace, who joins us right now. And when you talk about investigating Christianity as a homicide detective, which you are, you do talk about these principles that you use as a detective and applying them to apologetics. Now, what do you mean? Talk about some of these principles that you use.
Well, yeah, I try to give, there's some general principles that all of us, I think, know intuitively, or we are familiar because we've watched a lot of television, so we see some of these things. And I try to be very, very general at first, and I give them some specific application down the road. The biggest thing is understanding the difference between possible and reasonable. And typically, jurors have to learn this really quickly in homicide trials because everything and anything is possible, but only what's reasonable in light of the evidence presented are you even allowed to deliberate on once you go into that jury room. So if a theory is thrown out by the defense, and there's absolutely no evidence to substantiate that theory, or the evidence to substantiate the theory is incredibly weak, we have to keep it in perspective. So I'll give you an example of this. I had a homicide in which a man killed his wife for a certain amount of retirement money that he wanted to get, and she was clever enough to kind of get the money anyway, and he found out about it on a Wednesday and got his gun on a Thursday and killed her on a Friday. And afterwards, the defense, when we were in trial, suggested that this was perhaps a burglary gone bad. We had to stop and ask the jurors, hey, hang on a minute. Do you have any evidence of forced entry here in the house? No. Do you have any evidence anything was taken from the home? No. Do you have any evidence anyone was in the home other than the husband and wife who lived there? No. Do you have any evidence that anything in the neighborhood has got a rash of burglaries going on? No. Okay. You've got no good reason to believe that there is a burglary gone wrong here. Therefore, you're not even allowed to talk about it once you go in the jury room. You're only allowed to consider what's reasonable, the most reasonable inference from the evidence that's been presented to you. Now, this will help us, I think, a little bit when people throw out, isn't it possible that Jesus is a reinvention of Mithras? Or, okay, well, let's talk about that. Is there any evidence for this borrowing of the Jesus story from Mithras? If it is, let's take a look at it. And it turns out the more you push back on these ideas, the more you find they're unsubstantiated by the evidence. And we have to remember, they're just possibilities. And I would say, if you asked me today, isn't it possible that this happened? I would say yes, but it's not reasonable, and all that matters is reasonable. So these are some of the principles we try to kind of work through, evidential principles, and we try to teach in the book in order to help people see how to navigate the challenges of Christianity.
That is so great. Now, when you're doing a case, for example, don't you have to eliminate possibilities from what you start with before you can move on to an alternative theory?
Yes. As a matter of fact, that's another principle we try to teach. It's called abductive reasoning. And so when you walk in a room, sometimes we get called out to a lot of death scenes, but not all of them are criminal deaths. You can die naturally, you can die accidentally, you can commit suicide. Only one of the four possibilities is something I'm actually going to work as a homicide detective. So I got to walk in the room and say, well, what do I have here? Do I have an accidental, a natural, a suicide, or a homicide? And I do that by listing the pieces of evidence that I see in the room. I list the evidence, make a list. And then I list all the possible explanations for those items of evidence. And that list of possible explanations can be as bizarre as you want to start with, because eventually you're going to compare your list of possibilities to the evidences that are in the room, and only one will emerge as the most reasonable. And that process of elimination is called abductive reasoning. And this is what we do all the time. You and I do it when our kids come home late and they're telling us some story about why they've been out all night, and you're asking, well, what's the evidence I have to support that, that possibility?
I bet your kids love that, too.
I know. It's hard to live with. But the point is, everyone does this to one extreme or another. And we can do this also with the case for Christ. When you examine all the possible explanations for the resurrection, for example. You can use the same principles here when examining the claims of Christianity.
Okay, so let's do that. You threw that out there. Let's talk about the resurrection, for example. If somebody says, because there are a lot of different theories about the resurrection that would contradict the gospel accounts, that he rose from the dead on the third day and an angel rolled away the stone and he was gone. Some say that, Jesus never really died, or that somebody stole his body. How do you eliminate those possibilities?
Yes, what you do is it's a great point. And what you do here, you have to take a look at, first of all, let's list all the possibilities that are out there, because there are many different alternative explanations to what. Well, first of all, you start with looking at what's the minimal evidence. What's the evidence we are looking at here related to the resurrection? I think, and people have done great work on this. Mike Licona and Gary Habermas have written a book on this, the minimal facts approach. I think I was even more skeptical about what I would consider to be the minimal facts. I think I would agree, though, that the minimal facts are that Jesus died on the cross and was buried. That doesn't really say anything about the resurrection, if it's true or not, but it's a minimal fact. I mean, most of history there's records of this that are substantiated by external evidence also. I talk about that in the book, pagan sources from the first century. But the idea that Jesus lived has recently been challenged, but not reasonably been challenged. Right. So this is a simple, minimal piece of evidence. It doesn't mean that Jesus is God or any of this, but it's a simple piece. Jesus died on the cross. Jesus' tomb was empty. If it wasn't empty, we'd have no story here. So apparently the tomb was never discovered with the body. So an empty tomb is another piece of minimal evidence. And finally, the fact that Jesus' disciples believed they saw Jesus resurrected from the dead doesn't mean he actually was, just that they said they saw him. And maybe the last piece I would include would be that the disciples were transformed by this alleged sighting of the risen Christ. Now, none of this means that the story that the Christians offer is actually the most reasonable, because there are other possibilities. But when you look at the minimal facts and examine all the possible explanations, every explanation has liabilities, including the Christian one, by the way. And we have to simply say, which of these possible stories has the least liabilities? And I think when you do that, you'll discover pretty quickly that the Christian story does have a liability. It requires that a resurrection is possible. It requires that the miraculous can occur. But if you're willing to jump that hurdle, every other piece of evidence is explained completely by the Christian narrative. The problem I had as a non-believer was I had a presuppositional problem. I presupposed that nothing miraculous can ever happen. And how in the world can you fairly examine the claim of a miraculous God if you start off with the presupposition that nothing miraculous can exist?
Yes,
so
right.
That's one of the principles we talk about in the book. You have to start with your hands empty. You can't walk into a murder scene and say, I think that the murderer is going to be in this particular category. You have to let the evidence take you where it's going to go and not come in with your mind already made up.
Yeah. What about the witnesses angle? How do you determine in a cold case whether or not the evidence for the witnesses, what was left in the Gospels and what we're told by these men that you can't interview personally? How do you decide whether or not that was reliable evidence?
Yeah, I think there are 4 criteria that all jurors must examine in order to determine whether or not a witness on the stand is to be trusted. And in California, we have about 14 or 15 questions that judges present to jurors, and they say, hey, you can ask yourself these questions while you're listening to these witnesses. Make sure they pass your own test. And they break into 4 categories. Were the witnesses present? Are they somehow corroborated by anything on the outside evidentially? Have they been accurate, or has their story changed over time? And finally, are they biased in some way? And so what we did in the second half of the book was simply look at the gospel accounts under that template, those 4 areas of concern to jurors related to witnesses on the stand, I think can be applied to the Gospels.
And they stand after applying those principles to the eyewitnesses to Jesus' resurrection.
Yeah, and as a matter of fact, as I went through this process as a guy who was struggling to figure this out, I eventually had to surrender my presuppositions because they do pass the test. But if I'm not willing to lay down my philosophical naturalism, the thing that I started off with, I'm never going to come to the proper conclusion. But I do believe that if we use that template and we're willing to lay down our presuppositions against such things as God, we will eventually come to the proper conclusion.
That is fascinating. What would you say when you look at the Gospels overall? What would you say the strongest evidence is?
Well, I think it all comes down to the resurrection. I mean, this is what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15. If the resurrection is not true, we're to be pitied. And it's true. We're liars if it's not true. So you look at the book of Acts, and every single effort to evangelize the lost in the book of Acts begins and ends with the resurrection. And we saw the resurrection. And the Old Testament predicted this Messiah. And he proved he was the Messiah because he rose from the dead. The resurrection is the key piece of evidence that every eyewitness wants to offer in the first century to say, this is why Christianity is true. So for me, what I love about Christianity is it's rooted in an historical event that we can actually investigate.
Exactly.
Not every theistic worldview is rooted in an historical event that can actually be dug up and challenged. So I think what's great is that Christianity is falsifiable and it holds up to the test.
Well, now you raise an interesting question. I was talking to somebody recently we were laughing about this because it's absolutely true. On the one hand, when you have doubters or skeptics and non-Christians look at the Bible, on the one hand, they'll say, well, if the accounts of the witnesses to Christ are too similar, then it's collusion. But if they're too different, it can't possibly be true.
There's no doubt about this, and we see this all the time. And I one time had a case where I was an hour between the actual murder and getting out there because I live pretty far away from the crime. And when I finally get there, the officer was trying to do the witnesses a favor by keeping them dry, and he put all the witnesses in the back of one patrol car. So they sat there together talking for about 15 minutes before I got there, and it's a mess. I mean, I want the messy, seemingly contradictory narratives of each witness to be preserved as messy, seemingly contradictory narratives, because that's where the beauty is. I'm going to get different perspectives, not only physical perspectives, but historical perspectives of each witness, emotional perspectives of each witness, life experience perspectives, and all of that's going to come into play and give me the most robust view of what happened. And it's my job to figure out how everything puzzles together and to understand why the seeming contradictions are really not contradictory at all.
So that would be the conclusion then. When you look at these gospel accounts, they're alike enough to ring true, but different perspectives to make it look, obviously, that these people really saw what they said they saw.
Yeah, I think that they fit together in what J.J. Blunt wrote in the 19th century, and a pastor who identified these as undesigned coincidences. I call them the unintentional eyewitness report, because they do fit together in a way that is unintentional. So somebody writes something in one gospel, it leaves a question open, it's answered by another gospel who writes a gospel version that raises a question that the first gospel answered. So it's this puzzling back and forth that I think makes them so powerful.
I love that. And you said there are clues there to examine in the gospel accounts that stuck out for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially I was somebody who employed forensic statement analysis as a detective, and I would go through a suspect's statement. What'd you do yesterday, the day of the murder? And he would write down everything he did from the time he got up and the time went to bed. And I would look at that statement analysis written in ink, and I would try to figure out, is this the guy who did it? And if he did it, what time of day did he do it? And I would look at things like pronoun use and expansion of time, compression of time, lots of different factors in forensic statement analysis. And I did the same thing with the Gospel of Mark, because I understood that the earliest accounts were that Mark was writing Peter's account out in the Gospel of Mark, and I wanted to see if Peter's fingerprints were really on Mark's account. So I use this process, and I think that there are great, and I list all these evidences that I discovered in the book, there are good reasons to believe that Peter's fingers are on Mark's account in a way that's particular to Mark's account and no other account.
Isn't that interesting? Well, I know, too, you have your blog, pleaseconvinceme.com, and you've got great information there, too. But this is a great book. It's called Cold Case Christianity, A Homicide Detective Investigates the Claims of the Gospels. And has this been popular in your department, Jim, as you've passed this around to your fellow
because,
colleagues?
We just published. So I've started the website at coldcasechristianity.com, and so my partners are aware of it, but I get to give them a copy next Wednesday, so we'll see what they say.
Well, we'll pray it goes well, and just a great book. Thanks so much, J. Warner Wallace, for being with us, and God bless.
Thanks for having me, Janet. I appreciate you.
A pleasure. I appreciate you, too. Thanks, and we'll be back right after this.
You're listening to the next generation of Christian talk radio, The Janet Mefford Show. Janet wants to hear what's on your mind, and she's waiting for your call, toll free at 800-343-9282. That's 800-343-9282, or online at janetmefford.com. Once again, here is Janet Mefford.
Thanks for joining us. 34 past the hour, 800-343-9282. We've told you a lot about Hobby Lobby. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. There's a video out from the Beckett Fund all about the Green family, which is the family standing firm, obeying the Lord, refusing to pay for abortion even though Caesar is demanding it. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. They put out a video with the Greens speaking about this and giving it in their own words. So we'll get to that in a moment. But there's another story out relating to businesses that are paying a price because of leftist pagan policies. And this is from Christian News. A tourist company in Maryland, where, as you know, gay marriage has just come into being, has decided to end its wedding-related services. And why are they deciding to do this? Because they want to avoid lawsuits from homosexuals who believe that the business should be forced to accommodate same-sex so-called weddings. I don't blame him. Matt Grubbs is the owner of Discover Annapolis Tours, and he's a Christian. And he believes that the Bible clearly outlines that God created marriage to be a man and a woman. But because the state of Maryland has begun recognizing same-sex relationships as quote-unquote marriage as of the beginning of this year, he knew that the jig was up. He knew he was going to have to face either accommodating homosexuals who are going to try to use this service and violate his faith, and or he had to end the services altogether. So he said, I'm out. That's it. He'd been using his trolley rides as transportation venues for weddings. And they'd pick up the wedding party at a house and then take them to the church, and then they'd give them a ride back after the reception. And one of the testimonials on the website said it was the perfect start to a perfect day, and thanked them for the driver and the singing of the songs on the way to the chapel, and everybody liked it. Grubbs decided this right after the so-called gay marriage law passed by 5 percentage points in Maryland. And one of his quotes was, "We used to do weddings until recently, but we're a Christian-owned business, and we are not able to lend support to gay marriages. And as a public accommodation, we cannot discriminate between gay or straight couples, so we had to stop doing all wedding transportation." Wow. This is from Derek McCoy. Derek McCoy is the chairman of Maryland Marriage Alliance. And he spoke with WUSA TV in Baltimore, saying what I think is absolutely true. These types of stories are what you get when you change the definition of marriage.
These are the things that's going to happen. When you change the natural definition of marriage, there are consequences to it.
What about a wedding photographer or a limo operator who didn't want to do business with African-American couples? What's the difference there?
Well, again, we're not talking about racial discrimination that divides the races. We're talking about a natural concept of marriage that brings together the sexes.
What is the difference? You know, I would have loved to have been in that room and turned back to that reporter and said, "Are you serious? You see absolutely no difference between somebody's race and somebody's sexual preference? You're born black or white or red or what have you, and that's what you are. But that doesn't have anything to do with your character, and it doesn't have anything to do with your religious beliefs. It's just the color of your skin. That's all it is. That's not analogous." And perhaps you've been reading After the Ball, the LGBT agenda's Bible, quote unquote, small b. Now, over at Current TV, recently sold to Al Jazeera, by the way, and did you know that Al Gore is slated to be on the Al Jazeera board? Did you hear about this? Well, over at Current TV's The Young Turks, one of the lamest things on television today, they posted a video blog where Anna Kasparian from The Young Turks just couldn't contain her excitement that a Christian like Mark Grubbs is not going to be offering wedding services anymore. This is just awesome.
If you want to lose business and you want to lose money because of your own hatred, that's totally fine. Now that the country is progressing when it comes to gay rights, all of these businesses that are anti-gay are going to lose business anyway. I mean, this is the perfect example of the so-called free market, right? He has the right to get rid of an entire service if he wants to get rid of it, but at the same time, it's going to have consequences on his bottom line. And if he wants to put himself out of business, I'm totally fine with that.
You know what has been left behind is any recognition that Christianity has been around for 2,000 some years, before that Judaism, and that this has always been the position of Christianity. And we preceded you by many, 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 many years. Now, you can go back, obviously, homosexuality has been around too. But we haven't seen, until now, this widespread, previously civilized part of the world going backwards, which is what we're doing with all speed. Now, when we come back, I want to play for you some clips from the Green family, another brave Christian family who are doing what's right no matter what the cost. We'll be back. We're back 44 past the hour on the Janet Mefford Show, 800-343-9282. Well, as you know, Hobby Lobby has been much in the news lately because they are obeying the Lord rather than Caesar, and they are refusing to pay this unconstitutional HHS mandate fine. Well, they're going to pay the fines, but they're not going to pay for abortions. And in doing so, they're really taking a huge risk to their business. And this is why tomorrow a grassroots effort has been put together for Christians, especially, and anybody who wants to get involved to support Hobby Lobby. And I'm not telling you to do it, like ordering you to do it. Of course, I can't do that, but please do it. Please do it. This is going to cost them $1.3 million a day. Just to stand up for what is right, just to stand up for what is constitutional. And frankly, if we're going to make any sort of an impact on this White House and with the media, we need to be as bold and as visible on this as we were with the Chick-fil-A matter back in the summertime. That's what I really believe. So Hobby Lobby, Mardell, go to their website, send them letters of encouragement, but support them. Support them financially. Even if you only have $5 to go in and buy a thing of felt, some craft supplies, and tell them that you appreciate what they're doing. I think that's the best thing we can do right now, as well as pray for this family. Pray for this family. Now, I want to tell you a little bit more about the Green family. They're laying low right now, as you can imagine. But the Green family, which founded and currently owns Hobby Lobby, was filmed by the Becket Fund for Religious Liberty. That is the organization representing them, where they could explain in their own words why Christianity is so critical to their business. It's really a nice portrait of who this Green family is and shows their integrity. Here's Steve Green, the president of Hobby Lobby, talking about how you just can't separate your faith from your business.
The beliefs that we've had, that we have grown up with all our lives, are convictions that we have, that we live by personally. And as we have ran our business, we feel the obligation or the desire that we want to use those same principles within our business. It would not be consistent for us to live one way at home and then accept a different way at work. That would be inconsistent with our faith.
Here's another one. CEO David Green talking about Christian conviction and how it influences his business decisions every single day.
My convictions enter into how we run our business. The convictions on how we treat others. To do unto others as we would have them do unto us. So we're always asking those questions today. In fact, we've had vendors call us, and they couldn't believe it because it would be a longage, and they would send us $8,000 or $10,000 more than they should. And our people are advised to let them know longages as well as shortage. It's a conviction that we have based on sound biblical principles. And so in every area that we feel like that would be something contrary to God's Word, that becomes a conviction for us. And just caring about our people is a conviction. And so we want to love people, and we want to be example the best we can to be a Christian example to all of our employees.
Let me ask you something. Just listening to those few clips right there, does this sound like a group of people who ought to have their business run out by Obama? You know, this isn't like you're going after some sort of pornography business or some kind of business that is sleazy and immoral and should go out anyway because what they're doing is wrong. This is an example of some of the most admirable people you could ever have in any kind of a business. You're listening there to David Green talking about how they get too much inventory, they send it back. You know, I mean, the integrity that they use in their business. And no, I'm not getting any sort of kickbacks. This is all from the heart. I'm not paid to talk about Hobby Lobby. I just admire them. It's one thing to talk about, boy, if X happened, I would take a stand. And it's another thing to actually take it. It's one thing to say, if Obama ever tried X, I would not comply. And it's a whole different matter when you say, I'm not complying and it's going to cost me $1.5 million a day to not pay to slaughter children. That's huge. To put your business on the line, to put the jobs of so many thousands of people on the line because you run this business. And it's a business every Christian ought to get behind. And you know something else? We were talking about this behind the scenes. If we're going to make a big statement to this culture, then it can't just be Hobby Lobby that does this. It has to be hundreds of businesses who do this, who say we will not comply. We will not pay to murder children, and you will not make us. Now, you look at this story I was telling you about earlier, this tourist company in Maryland that is ending wedding-related services because they don't want to be sued by homosexuals. Obama loves this stuff. The left loves this stuff. You heard it in the quote that I played for you from the Young Turks. Well, good. If they're going to be full of hatred and they're just not going to be progressive and move into the 21st century, then they deserve to be run out of business. They deserve not to have a business. This is the attitude of the left. This is the attitude of non-Christians. And this is how hostile it's getting in this country. We don't really care about your right to run a business. You do it our way or you're going to be run out on a rail. And if you don't think we can do it, think again. This is only the beginning. And I'm not willing to be at a point right now where I would say it's over. It isn't over, but it'll be over if Hobby Lobby is the only company that takes a stand like this and says we will not comply. We will not pay. There have to be more. There have to be more. Because if they're the only one and they end up going out of business, then Obama and his cohorts go, see, that's what happens when you don't obey. You get in line with Caesar, or you can kiss your business goodbye. Meanwhile, I'm going to give all kinds of special sweet deals to my buddies on the left who have huge $1 million companies. They get some sort of an exemption on Obamacare, right and left. But those Christians, they got to go. They've got to go. We found out yesterday, President Obama issues a signing statement related to Section 533 of the National Defense Authorization Bill, in which he says it's not necessary to protect the religious freedom of chaplains. And I signed it, but I'm against it. And that's how his administration will govern, no doubt like they did with DOMA. We're just not going to enforce it. This is the man who is now our president. And for a second term, Americans put him there. And we're on a sinking ship, but we're not drowned yet. So pray for this family, the Green family. Pray for this man, Matt Grubbs, and all the brave Christians like this who are saying, Caesar, I must obey the Lord. We'll come back right after this. One important story of note, this is from the Free Beacon. Another business won temporary relief yesterday from the HHS mandate, bringing the total number of injunctions against the mandate to 10. So it's not all bad news out there. The United States District Court for the Northern District of Illinois granted Triune Health Group preliminary injunctive relief against the mandate. They cite here from Christopher and Marianne Yep, the owners of Triune Health Group. It says they are ardent and faithful Catholics, and they object to the government forcing them to purchase insurance for drugs and services to which they object based on their religious convictions. Good. Keep up the good work, folks. I'm so glad there are so many who are suing and getting injunctions. I don't know what happened with the Hobby Lobby case, but that goes on. All right, very briefly, because I just thought this was kind of an interesting commentary on our times. Did you know that apparently biblical names are falling out of popularity? You know, you hear these baby name stories every year, and I know, wasn't it last year and they said the most popular baby name in Europe now is Muhammad? It was number 1 or number 2. It was way up there. Well, this is from the Huffington Post talking about this. The original story was on the Daily Mail. The Bible is out and 50 Shades of Grey is in. Only 3 boys' names from the Bible made Baby Center's top 10 list for 2012. No biblical girls' names made the list, which is a stark contrast from 12 years ago. 12 years ago, biblical names dominated the top 10 list. In 2000, the names at the top of the list for babies were Michael, Jacob, Matthew, Joshua, Joseph, and Andrew. And for girls in the year 2000, it was Hannah, Sarah, and Elizabeth. But now it's all Downton Abbey and 50 Shades of Grey. But whether Bible names are on the way out might all depend on how you define a trend in baby names. Is it how many biblical names are in the top 10 list or the top 100? Is it how many places those names dropped or climbed on the list? Do you count variations on names with biblical roots? But really, the question of whether the Bible is waning as an influence for baby names seems to have been first raised last week by WND. Editor Joe Kovacs points out that in 1960, 8 out of 10 of the top boys' names were inspired by the Bible. And he goes on to note there were 33 boys' names from Scripture in 2012 compared to 36 about 12 years ago. And that difference doesn't seem to suggest a big plummet, but they were in significantly higher positions 12 years ago, the biblical names, than they were just this past year. So unfortunately, this is a sign of our times. But yeah, I mean, names go through cycles as well. I mean, you see this. You see this all the time. Names that were really popular 5 years ago fall out of favor, and sometimes newer and weirder baby names come along. I'm very traditional that way. We have some biblical names in our family. Not all of them, but they're there. Thank you for joining us. We are out of time, but we invite you to visit us at our website. It's janetmefford.com. And speaking of liberty, if you have not signed our petition to Congress to uphold the Second Amendment, now's the time to get involved. You don't have to buy anything. You don't have to join anything. Just click on that petition. Help protect the Second Amendment. Just put your name in your state. That's all you need to do. And join us in our efforts to tell Congress we want our liberty. We'll leave it there. God bless you. Thanks for being with us.